And then I will turn on our transcript. All right, so I'd like to welcome everybody to our last PRIISM seminar of the semester. Thank you so much for joining us. And we are, I guess, maybe before I start with our introduction for today's speaker, just a couple reminders. Just please stay on mute during the presentation unless you have a question, in which case, if it's a clarifying question, just please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask the speaker directly. Otherwise, you can type it in chat and I'll moderate the chat questions. And if you have sort of larger substantive questions, please feel free to hold them until the end. And this recording will be made publicly available on our YouTube channel afterwards. So with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Professor John MacDonald, who is a professor of criminology and sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a fellow of the Academy of Experimental Criminology and the past recipient of the David N. Kershaw Prize from the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management for contributions to public policy. He's currently co-editor of the Journal of Quantitative Criminology, and his recent research on racial disparities in criminal justice and the effect of changing places on crime appears in American Journal of Public Health, Annual Review of Criminology, Journal of Quantitative Criminology, and Journal of Experimental Criminology. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor MacDonald, and I guess you can share your slides and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. I'm looking forward to this talk, sharing some work. I'm going to walk through one of my more recent papers, but I'm going to try to frame the paper in some larger discussion about the role of changing places in crime. I'm going to focus quite a bit of the talk, though, around some of the quantitative applications, in the hopes that that'll generate some discussion and potentially, encourage some of you that are interested in crime and justice issues to think about maybe similar applications. Okay, so. All right, so from. Okay, so today's talk's going to really be highlighting this paper that I believe Ravi might have shared that appears in the Journal of Experimental Criminology. And if any of you are interested, don't have a copy of the paper and are interested in reading it, feel free to email me as well. And so this paper is basically asking the question of looking at the effect of remediating vacant lots in crime and whether those effects are moderated by nearby land uses. Just acknowledge my collaborators on this project, or Viet Nguyen, who's a PhD student in criminology and was very interested in spatial analysis. Shane Jensen, who is a statistics professor at Penn and has been interested in the last couple of years in big data and urban analytics. And Charlie Brannis, who is a professor at epidemiology now at Columbia, who I've been collaborating with on this work for now 10 years. So the motivation behind thinking about place in crime is from the observation that many criminologists are aware of, that crime is highly concentrated by place. Somewhere between 3 to 6% of street segments account for about 50% of reported crime to the police. As well as if you look at calls for service data or even more serious crime like shootings, where we're less concerned about underreporting. Concentration of crime by place also appears to be relatively stable over time, suggesting there might be endemic features of crime hotspots, things about places that really tend to consistently make them prone to higher rates of crime. In 1989, Larry Sherman, a criminologist who wrote an article basically on the routine activities of crime in place, argued that we should be thinking more about the routine activities of places because potentially they can be regulated more effectively than persons. And the question then is, what are some of the salient features then of the built environment that generate more crime? And I'm just going to give you a couple more examples. Again, I said a small number of places in every major city generate the majority of serious crime. So in Philadelphia, about 5% of addresses between 2006 and 2017 accounted for 50% of all reported crime in the city. We see similar statistics, for example, in St. Louis, looking at street segments. I imagine you'd find the same thing if you looked at data in New York City as well. Here's just a graph to kind of show you what I'm talking about conceptually. So you can see on the x-axis the percentage of places, the percentage of blocks, the percentage of tracks, and percentage of police service areas. So going from smaller to higher levels of geography. And then on the y-axis, I have the percentage of crime. And you can see that, at 5% of places, you get 50% of crime. Some of this is obviously a mechanical effect of aggregation, but it still, I think, illustrates the point that we could think more strategically about places. And this connects to a lot of work I've been doing on thinking about changing places, but not just in the issues of trying to reduce crime, but also trying to improve health in communities. And that work is actually featured in a book that came out last year that I was author of with Charlie Brannis and Bob Stokes called Changing Places, where we're advocating for trying to use science and field experiments, preferably, to actually work with communities and redesign them to be safer and healthier places. So part of the motivation for this is, it goes back to some concepts. For example, Thomas Frieden, who was the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, pointed out this concept of the impact pyramid. And if you can see my cursor, the idea here is that, if we think about what factors contribute, and this could be crime, but in his case, he was thinking about health. But we could think about crime, we could think about community health. And obviously, socioeconomic factors, or what sociologists refer to as structural factors, are going to be the most important contributors to health and safety in communities. Those things are very difficult to change. On the other hand, if we think about the context and where people live, where they make kind of default decisions, how the built environment affects people's lives, that's something that I think we have some purchase on potential changes. And the idea is, if you change the kind of environment in which people are working or living, then efforts to do things like reduce crime require a lot less individual effort. And I'll go through then this example. So it turns out that one of the features of high crime areas are vacant lots and abandoned buildings. We see this in a number of cities historically and contemporaneously. So those features of the built environment that are endemic of crime. At the same time, there's a possibility that vacant lots and abandoned buildings may be more prone to crime when they're near by what criminologists often refer to as crime generators. So these are activity spaces, particularly among strangers, that undermine kind of the collective ownership of places. So you could think of that as terms of a transit station, bars or taverns, or even during certain times of days, schools, if they're generating lots of kids in a place and maybe just outside the school. So there's some theoretical foundation for this. It tends to be kind of broadly based in what's called environmental criminology. And that's the idea that physical disorder physical disorder of the built environment can actually influence crime through a number of potential mechanisms, including influencing neighborhood socialization, what Rob Sampson and Felton Earls referred to as collective efficacy. And the idea is, vacant lots with overgrown weeds, tall grass, litter, for example, might signal to neighborhood that there's a hole in the social fabric, It might diminish people's perceptions among residents that they're active guardians that intervene if they witness criminal activity. This is basic concept of collective efficacy, and also may shape kind of unconscious social interactions. What Jane Jacobs kind of famously referred to in her work about eyes upon the street, and particularly having more eyes upon the street when there are natural proprietors. So people who feel like they have a stake in what's happening on that street. This also connects to some ideas of broken windows theory, the idea that physical disorder can lead to a reduction in formal social control. And I would just point out that if you actually read broken windows theory, not broken windows policing, it actually talks about the important role of physical disorder in sending a signal that an area is uncared for. Now, there's a whole other kind of allotment of theories that talk about how physical disorder and land use also shape just opportunities for crime. This is found in crime prevention through environmental design, situational crime prevention, crime pattern theory. But I'll stop lecturing on criminology and just try to use this as a background for kind of informing why we might think that vacant lots in particular would be criminogenic. It turns out there's some evidence now that's growing that vacant lot remediation can help curb crime. There's several quasi-experimental studies. There's a recent paper on this in Chicago in the Journal of American Planning Association. There's a paper on effort in Flint, Michigan. There's several papers that I've been involved in, including an RCT, which I'm going to expand on today, in Philadelphia. There's a paper looking at vacant lot remediation in New Orleans, and there's a paper looking at Youngstown, Ohio. I may be even missing a paper or two out there. The advantage of these papers is they actually look at what happens when you change or you remediate vacant lots. It's one thing to say they're correlated with crime, but that doesn't really tell us if removing them or repairing them would actually reduce crime. And these studies give us some purchase on that. So this work that I'm going to talk about today comes out of more than a decade collaboration with the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society and their land care program. So this program started as a pilot in a neighborhood called Kensington in Philadelphia in 1996. Some local residents were really frustrated by the level of the overgrown vacant lots in their neighborhood, the trash that was being accumulated there, their perception of crime and safety. And so they noticed the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society was running a vacant, not a vacant lot, but a community garden program. And this neighborhood association approached PHS and basically said, hey, would you be willing to consider cleaning up a couple of vacant lots? And that was the genesis for starting this program, was just a community partnership between a community organization and a nonprofit horticultural society and I'll show you the picture here. So this is a basic kind of model that they came up with, which is a fairly simple change to abandoned spaces that have been overgrown. So what they do is they basically remove the trash and debris. They'll grade the land, they'll plant some grass and install a fence. You can walk through this fence, but it's just to provide a visual sense that someone is taking care of the place and also prevent illegal dumping. So you can't back a pickup truck up onto the vacant lot. The program started, like I said, in 1996, and for the last about 10 years now, Keith Green has been running the program. Keith actually started out doing the work himself, and over time, was promoted into running the program. And if you're interested in it, I would encourage you to go and look at the program online. There's some videos of Keith and the work that his team does to remediate these lots. And I just say that this program's expanded over the years from 1996. Now it's citywide. It happens in every kind of area of Philadelphia. and it's being scaled. So today I want to talk though about how this paper extends kind of earlier work. So we have both initially an observational study, and then we built on that observational study and did a field experiment. And in both studies, we found crime reductions. Now, one of the critiques I imagine that that people often have, maybe some of you listening, of randomized trials or field experiments, is that even if you observe effect, maybe it's not sustainable. Our earlier observational study also, we really only looked at a couple of years, basically a year to two around each vacant lot during a specific period of time. And so what we really wanted to do here was kind of extend the randomized controlled trial, as well as the observational study over a longer time frame, and to look specifically not just at the main effect of remediating vacant lots, but what happens when lots are remediated near land uses that may be more or less criminogenic. And so you could think of that kind of an effect moderation kind of study. This is to give you a map. So we have got the data from the Horticultural Society on the 4,000 lots that they'd remediated between 2006 and 2018. They're currently overseeing something like a little over 12,000, might have been as much as 13,000 lots in the city. We matched those to control lots, so lots that were in violation of city ordinance as well, but the PHS hadn't taken control of to remediate yet. And we matched them based on location. So I'll walk you through now kind of so the basic study design we have here is a pre-post with a comparison control, or what economists refer to as a difference in differences design. This design is, may know, that goes back to Campbell and Stanley from like 1963. And so, it's a pre-post design with a non-equivalent control group. So the idea we had is, let's extend this work. Let's look at 24 months in a more recent time period, 24 months before and after lots are greened. So in the observational study, we're going to compare those to lots that remain vacant. We're going to pick control lots that were in the same census tracts. So the idea is that the areas at least have similar demographics and socioeconomic characteristics like concentrated poverty. And they're matched at the same time frame, so we can control for historical effects. That way the historical effects will be common to both. And then kind of the last thing that we do is we process the data using so that we ensure that control lots are equivalent to the green treated lots on pre-crime trends. So many of you are probably aware that any kind of difference in difference study really relies on the assumption that the two groups are trending similarly before the intervention. And so decided to use entropy balancing as an approach to achieve that. And I'll just mention what that is kind of quickly, which is the basic idea, right, is you want to create a counterfactual that's comparable, at least in the pre-period. And so we're trying to estimate, in this case, small theta, but basically the idea is the difference between, the two groups before and after treatment, but we're concerned that maybe the control group would be trending differently. In other words, maybe it has higher on average crime, or so there could be regression to the mean. And so what we're doing is we're essentially reweighting the control group to be similar, comparable to the green treated group in the pre-period. So in month -24 to -2. And then we just use entropy balancing as a reweighting scheme. You could do this with other approaches, it's equivalent in some ways, very similar to propensity score weighting. I've just found that this algorithm is very efficient at a couple of things. One, it gives you perfect balance, so it's hard to beat perfection. And then two is it tends to preserve sample size. And I'm happy to talk about that more in Q&A. But the proof here, I think, is in the balance. So the top panel just shows you that, and this is partially just mechanical, that greened and vacant lots do look similar in terms of demographics, age, income, percent of vacant housing. And part of that's mechanical because we've matched already on census tract. So these are extremely poor areas of Philadelphia. And you can see that, 50% of households earn less than $20,000 a year. It's disproportionately, there's also, it tends to be, have a slightly younger population. It's disproportionately Black. So again, really poor parts of Philadelphia are receiving this intervention. And there's a whole backdrop behind the historical reasons for the amount of vacant lots, which I'd be happy to talk about as well. But in terms of the actual balancing algorithm, the idea is to really balance on the pre-period. And you can see that if you look at the greening before, that kind of the average amount of crime, and these crimes I should have mentioned are based on kernel density estimates. So basically what we do is we draw a buffer around each lot of 500 feet, and we reweight crime from around that at its distance around that buffer. And the idea is to try to put more weight on crimes that are occurring per square feet around each lot. Part of that's to better contribution of what effect the lot has on crime nearby, and also it controls for things like concerns you might have with spatial autocorrelation. Main thing you can see is that after balancing, where you see a vacant before W, that where there are some small imbalances, they're comparable after weighting. Ultimately, I'm going to be estimating a difference in difference models. So the model, standard errors will be different, but the effects you should be able to see with the descriptive table, which is just a comparison of mean before, a mean after minus mean before of the treatment group minus the mean after of the control group minus the mean before. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about some of the measures of moderation. So we decided to think about theoretically what kind of land uses nearby might influence crime, or the effect, that moderating effect of vacant lot remediation. And so we selected schools, transit stations, and alcohol outlets. These are there's multiple generations of research just find these are correlated with crime. So we basically had a buffer about, and we had distances around these, and we counted whether or not there was a bar, a club or restaurant that served alcohol, whether there was a transit station, and whether there was a school. We also measured the prevalence of commercial and mixed-use properties for the 2 years before the intervention. So the idea is, going back to work like Jane Jacobs, is that maybe, when you have mixed use, there might be proprietors of the space, places, only commercial activity. There's some research to suggest that might actually increase crime. And so the idea is to kind of try to get some measure of the vibrancy of the area. We also actually try to measure actual business activity by getting all the business license data, geocoding it, and looking at basically the 8 different businesses we measured, and then their hours of operation, to try to measure kind of high versus low business activity. And we use this for both the observational study as well as the randomized controlled trial. So the randomized controlled trial, we didn't have to do any pre-processing on pre-trends, because we randomized which areas were getting the vacant lot remediation, which weren't. And if you had a chance to look at the paper, it was a randomized trial of 541 lots, but they were randomized by cluster. I believe, top of my head, I think it was 33 clusters. for the randomized control trial, one other thing we added, which we couldn't do with the observational study, is we also looked at some survey data at baseline to see if nearby residents that report more social cohesion, if maybe the vacant lot greening has a bigger effect there. If they're already kind of neighborly, they're interacting with each other, they trust their neighbors, maybe this intervention will have even a bigger effect, is what we were thinking. All right, so the basic idea then is we have a fixed effects regression and we also try to account for spatial autocorrelation. So we have, a dummy variable for each lot. We have whether the lot, when the lot becomes greened, it goes from 0 to 1, and then we have a fixed effect for each lot. We've already balanced on time. And then for the observational study, just remember that it's effectively a weighted regression. That the weights are 1 if you're the treatment group, and then the weights are bigger than 0, and for the comparison group. And the idea is by reweighting you get comparability. In terms of spatial autocorrelation, this tends to be this is a concern for all kinds of fields. I've personally never been super satisfied with different efforts that are used. I mean, I can remember from 20 years ago where, it's like, oh, you got to use a contiguity matrix, or you have to take, and take the average around, or you have to use the distance or the log of the distance. And I was to myself, I said, well, why should we assume it's the log of the distance, or what do we know? We don't know what the functional form is. So, in my own work, I've used different approaches, but in a collaboration on a different paper, Jeff Grogger at the University of Chicago pointed out this paper by Bester, Conley, and Hansen, where they came up with something that's, I think, pretty simple and made some intuitive sense to me, at least, which is basically you just cluster the standard errors at the levels of geography, and you assess whether, in fact, that it changes, your estimate. The standard errors does the interpretation of your estimate. Obviously, it's not going to change your estimate. Your estimate is but do you get substantive difference in interpretation? And then you don't have to make any assumptions about the functional form, and so that's what we did in this study. We looked at standard errors at the block level, block group, and census tract level. And for the randomized trial, our standard errors are clustered at the unit of randomization, since it was technically a clustered randomized trial. All right, now I'll walk you through some of the results. So that's the basic setup of the model, fairly simple estimator. And what we see then is, and I'll highlight the bottom here. So we've scaled everything to percentage change. So when a vacant lot's greened, you get roughly 21% reduction in monthly robbery levels, rates. And column 2 gives us an estimate of, well, how much of that effect is also moderated by the interaction with nearby land uses. And here you can see the only effect we really see is in schools, that it looks like there's less of effect when it's nearby a school, which makes some theoretical sense. If you think that schools are potentially, there's going to be more anonymity around those spaces. We see kind of the effect so this is for robbery. For assault, we don't see, again, we see a small reduction. It's not statistically significant in assault. We see a reduction in reported drug offenses. We see a reduction in public order offenses. So this is when people call and they report about disorder and vandalism to the police. And then total crime is just a summation of all these crime categories. So we got a 6% reduction in total reported crime. And it looks like that effect is moderated. Again, here it comes across where we, in the total, some moderation around train stations, so less of an effect. Some evidence, again, that less of effect near bars. And then the kind of the school association with robbery disappears. Obviously, this isn't super compelling evidence of effect moderation, though. This is just a graph just to kind of display the effect here we're seeing in robberies. And just to note, you can see, and again, by pre-processing the data, if you will, entropy balancing, the two groups are identical on their averages in the robberies before, but what you see is that vacant lot greening drops proportionally. And obviously, this would be messier if I plotted it by month, but you would see, a bouncing down at kind of a lower equilibrium. Okay, so now I want to just explain a little bit about the results from the randomized control trial. And just to say again, we see some reductions here. We don't see a significant reduction in robbery. Part of this is it's a little bit underpowered. There's just fewer locations, fewer robberies, but the same direction. We see a reduction in assaults, some, again, reductions in reported drug offenses, public order offenses, and overall a total reduction in reported crime. Here we don't see anything for trains or bars, although it's in the same direction. It's just not statistically significant. Standard errors are too big. And we do see some evidence, though, of looks like reduction around areas that are a little bit where there's more business vibrancy. And social cohesion doesn't seem to moderate it. It's in the direction of that there might be some moderation, but again, the standard errors are too big. In terms of actually plotting out, if we look at this by kind of a quantile of business activity, we do see essentially that the upper 75th percentile of business activity, there does seem to be a greater reduction. And if we went back to the original observational study, you'd see the direction's the same for business activity, it just wasn't statistically significant. And so there's some suggestive evidence that business activity, at least within the trial, might be important. Now, a natural question comes up in any of these kinds of place-based studies is displacement. Well, is it possible that, even though we try to adjust standard errors for different levels of geography, then maybe you're just mechanically, this intervention, when the PHS comes in and they clean and green an area, then it might just push crime to a vacant lot nearby. And there's no perfect way to test for displacement. So what we did, I think, is defensible in both the quasi-experiment and the RCT, is we looked at different buffers. So we looked at the 500-foot buffer, which is where our KDE estimates came from, our kernel density. Then we looked at a buffer of 500 to 1,000 feet and then 1,000 to 1,500 feet. And if we thought that displacement was going to happen, what you would expect, right, is that crime would go down in the immediate zone, and that would go up in the adjacent zone. And we don't see that. In fact, we see that crime continues to go down. And this is true, when we even cluster at the track level. And we see that in both studies, that kind of direction, if anything, would be a spillover benefit, not displacement. So just kind of wrap up some of the conclusions here. I think we've got evidence again that the crime reducing benefits of the Philadelphia Land Care Vacant Lot Greening Program. I think what's important here is we show that they're sustained as the program expanded across the city, specifically also during a period with substantially a lot less crime than our initial study. Our initial study was done on data from the late 90s to 2008, and this is in a lower crime period. The vacant lots, when they're green nearby train station alcohol outlets, it suggests there's less total crime, of a total crime reduction benefit than when they're further away from these locations. There's some suggestive evidence that greening near active businesses may produce larger benefits. Potentially, the business owners themselves become more effective guardians of these places than when they're overgrown when you have overgrown vacant lot near a business. And a big limitation to this study, obviously, is we're speculating on what the potential mechanisms are. And so, if this kind of work, I think the next generation of this research should look at some type of activity data. So if you could get foot traffic data, if you could get measures of where people are actually using spaces, then, that would be the ideal study, is you could see, what happens. We have qualitative evidence. We've done focus groups. Some of my collaborators have done focus groups. There's a descriptive study showing that people are more likely to use this space for pro-social activities like having a picnic, a garden, even sometimes putting, playground equipment on them, et cetera. But we don't really have empirical evidence that how people are changing their use of these spaces. And so I think that would be the ideal study in the future, not just in Philadelphia, in any urban setting. What happens when you change the spaces? How is it being used differently? And that could, I think, provide a lot more clarity on the mechanisms. The last thing I'll just say is that this intervention is relatively cheap to do. There's lots of discussions right now about reimagining public safety. You can't get much cheaper than remediating vacant lots. It's about $1,500 to $2,000 to remediate a vacant lot, and a couple $100 a year to maintain. It's the equivalent of maintaining, some lawns on a property, biweekly mowing and trash cleanup during between March and November. So if you're thinking about, policies that potentially could reduce crime and improve community safety, I think this one should be given top consideration for cities like Philadelphia that have vacancy, a lot of vacant lot land use. Obviously it's going to differ. Cities like most of you, I assume, live in New York City. Vacant lots aren't a problem in New York, in most parts of New York, but they are probably in certain parts of New York, maybe the outer boroughs. But Philadelphia, like lots of deindustrial cities or legacy cities, has Baltimore, Youngstown, Ohio, probably can name 75 cities that have a lot of vacant lots. And this program appears to both be effective, relatively cheap to implement, and scalable with the right team, right types of groups like PHS. So look forward to questions about technical material, theoretical material, et cetera.
Thank you so much. I'll clap on behalf of everybody. Thank you for a great presentation. And yeah, let's open it up to questions. So please feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question. And as usual, I'd like to encourage any students on this call to please particularly encourage you to ask questions.
Well, this is Pat Shroud. I'm not a student, but I'll give the students a chance to think of their question. I think this is a fascinating presentation, and I like the methods, and I really liked your results. This may not be fair, but I'm just wondering if there's any collateral damage to the community in terms of gentrification of this program, whereby people who can just barely find affordable housing can no longer find affordable housing after it gets screened up.
Yeah, this is a good question, and it's we address it especially in our book. I think it's there are very few sections of Philadelphia where there's been some new housing development that's led to some gentrification from this program, but that's a very small subsection of the intervention. Most of these areas are extremely poor. This program is actually designed with the goal of eventually leading to new affordable housing being created on vacant lots or remediated to make it more desirable places to build. So there really isn't evidence of this leading to gentrification, other than I said there's one section of Grace Ferry where lots were remediated, and there was a big there's quick transition to building row homes. But for the most part, this is really just trying to improve the built environment for the neighborhoods, for the neighbors that live there, and the goal eventually being there would be some new housing development. But we just haven't had that, so we haven't had that kind of unintended consequence. The one thing I'd say though is it's something to watch out for. I mean, there are, you could imagine, I mean, this gets outside of the scope of doing the research, but you can have policies that try to homestead, affordable housing policies, inclusive zoning. There's other things that can be done to try to prevent that. Yeah, a quick change in inequality where you have a house that's, I mean, some of the average row home for sale in some of these areas is like $50,000. You can't build a house and sell it for $50,000. So any new housing is even more expensive than that. But new affordable housing could be built, and some of it has been built, but that's, and obviously you can have restrictions or some effort to try to create. Now obviously there's trade-offs. If you restrict too much building, then maybe it won't happen. So I don't have an easy answer other than to say it's there isn't evidence, at least, of this happening systemically in Philadelphia. Oh, and last thing I'll just say is the residents love this program in Philadelphia. I'd say, I mean, this is like they ask for it, because it just, I mean, you go there, you realize it's like you take a place that really is run down, and then all of a sudden it's this nice green space. It's like, who doesn't like that? Sorry, go ahead. Question.
Yeah, thanks. Do you observe demographic characteristics after the treatment? So does it stay the same in this greening area, or it has changed?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Demographic data changes pretty slowly, and so the best of our evidence is, at least over a couple of year periods, there aren't major demographic changes in terms of income, race, and age in the areas that are treated. So over the longer term, that it's possible. But yeah, like you said, the main way that you would see that if there was a boom in housing or business development, right around these areas. It also just, again, if you spend time in Philadelphia in these neighborhoods, your main concern is depopulation. That that just aren't enough. Some of these areas have been completely abandoned. They have 20 to 30% of the population they used to have.
So I have a question, and I apologize because I know I'm guessing the answer to this was in the slides, but at different points in time, and I just haven't been able to piece it all back together, because I know you showed overall crime rates and trends in the beginning, I think. And then, so I was just wondering, like, if people aren't committing as many crimes in front of, in the direct areas of the green, where the greening has happened, are they just moving a couple blocks over? Like,
yeah, so we don't have that evidence.
Yeah,
we see, if anything, it looks like there's spillover benefits. Now, the question might be, the problem with a study like this is you can't really say, I mean, you can kind of back out what share of the crime reduction in the city you might think is attributable to this, but you can't, what am I trying to say? Other than looking at kind of spatial displacement, I can't think of a way that tells you there's surely some displacement of crime, certain types of crimes that, but one of the things is these vacant lots. So they become often used for open air drug dealing, which the drug itself doesn't lead to violence, but the nature of the market does. So obviously people don't stop buying drugs just because a lot was green. So the question is, we found is that some ethnographic work that collaborator did, where he actually hung out in these areas, found that the drug dealers were essentially more likely to move indoors, on these blocks. And then there's less shootings because you don't have the same kind of, potential for a beef over the space. But that's very specific to that. I also just think that, when you have a situation where people are often drinking alcohol, hanging out in a vacant lot, crime, and violence is kind of a natural byproduct of that. And I think that, so it's not that people stop drinking, but you might not have that same kind of, empty space that's not being cared for in the community. And then there's the last thing I'd say is fear. Is we do have evidence that people are less fearful of going outside when the lots have been green. So, maybe if, people withdraw, they're, and you have a lot of, people, you have a bunch of people hanging out the vacant lot across from your house, and they're drinking and fights break out and so forth, that could prevent you from going outside. So, but that doesn't mean that crime just disappears miraculously. But I think that marginally, I think the effects are pretty convincing.
Super helpful. Thanks.
Can I follow up on that? I'm just curious if there's another way as well to show a little more evidence about the displacement or lack thereof. You looked at the impact on these distal buffers, right, around the vacant lots. But if people are, if people were hanging out in a given lot, now it becomes not as good a place for hanging out because it's been greened. You might expect those people to move to the nearest vacant lot that is not greened. So I'm wondering, if just a descriptive look at crime changes in the nearest non-greened vacant lot might be useful to do, which probably is further away, obviously, than the buffers.
It's possible. I mean, one idea I thought about, I didn't pursue, was to actually kind of use what you're saying, basic idea, but with a little even more kind of even being a little bit more theoretically informed, in sense of like actually finding vacant lots that weren't green, that have they're nearby and kind of have similar properties, if you will, like in terms of like, it like a kind of comparable type of lot where it'd be easy to hang out and gather and so forth. And so in that kind of setting, then I think you might have a better chance of kind of setting up kind of a, if you think about it, like there's a set of potential markets for kind of criminal activity to happen around vacant lots. And then you say, okay, some of them are green. Let's find the ones that weren't green that have kind of similar potential. Then I think that would be, I agree. I think that would be a great direction for future research. I mean, it is amazing though how places can become can change quickly and almost I'd say unconsciously. If a place becomes an attractive spot, and then it's broken up, it might not, it might be the case that it's not as convenient anymore. So people don't go to that spot, don't naturally then kind of recongregate at another nearby spot. But I think having places a kind of ideal congregation, if you will, would potentially be a great direction.
Can I ask another question? This I think is a long shot, but I'm just wondering if police patrols responded to the greening initiative in any way. That is, you're working with reported crime, and that's going to be in some measure, related to the availability of police on the street to report crime to. And I'm wondering if, once a place is green, is it less likely to be patrolled by police because now it's perceived as a safer spot, and thus police aren't around as much to receive crime reports. Do you have any sense of how police patrols evolved in this period, or whether they evolved in response to the greening?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first, I would say the fact that we find this evidence, even shootings go down, I would say is, I wouldn't, those aren't underreported, if you will.
Right. Though that percentage reduction was much less than Rocky.
Yeah. So there is that potential. I don't have any evidence that the city of Philadelphia, the police didn't change their patrol patterns in response to this.
Okay.
The Philadelphia police, until trying to remember when the change was, it was before this, but the Philadelphia the police did change their patrol boundaries in about 2000. When would that have been? About 2008 or so. They hadn't changed them before then since 1976. So it's not exactly a very responsive department because you imagine neighborhoods changed, the demands for services changed, but they were still driving around the same boundaries with the same allocation of officers for, between 1976 and 2008 or so. So they did have a new patrol boundaries, but they didn't change the response to this. And they were the police commissioner at the time when their first study came out, Charles Ramsey, was excited to hear about the results, but they were largely unaware. I mean, this program wasn't in their mind as a crime prevention program. But then when they heard about the evidence, they said, yeah, it makes sense. We like seeing those lots cleaned up, but it wasn't in partnership. It is, to me, though, I do have a mind. I would love to see a city actually engage the police in actually cleaning up vacant lots in terms of trying to design. And if you think about something that the police could do that actually would build goodwill with the community, actually helping clean up a neighborhood, getting the litter, getting the trash, clean up a vacant lot. I mean, that to me would be a good community policing project that a police department, even if they weren't directly doing the work, they could be engaged in figuring out which sites would be really worthy of remediation and working with neighborhoods. I pitched that idea about 10 years ago in Philadelphia, and maybe now's the time other cities could think about that as well.
That's a great idea. Thanks.
I guess I had a question, and I know you sort of touched on this at the end of your talk, but I was just thinking about this sort of idea of like what gets you the most bang for your buck in terms of, so I was actually surprised by how affordable it sounded like remediation was. The cost sounded like pretty low to me, even for maintenance. And I'm sort of aware of other work, which is, looks at effects of like lighting changes and things like that. And I'm just curious, you could also imagine taking this amount of money and, again, forgetting about sort of like other effects of this. You could imagine, say, hiring one additional officer in this area. And I'm curious if you have, if you could just say a little bit more about sort of the relative like affordability or like efficiency of some of these different kinds of.
Yeah. So, I mean, because by any metric, if you take serious crime, right, it's expensive, right, in terms of people's willingness to pay to avert, how it affects property values, the trauma, et cetera, right? So, so crime is, costly, obviously. And this intervention, so when you look at any kind of the analysis we've done before, looking at relative cost effectiveness, it's extremely cost effective. For a $15,000 vacant lot, marginal investment in vacant lot remediation, you can avert a shooting effectively. Now, that's not. Now, I have to say that there's a big bandwidth around that estimate because that's like out of our RCT. So there's issues of but I think it's extremely cost effective in that regard, and that's not including the other potential benefits about just fear, about just the neighborhood feeling better. I think the big challenge cities is scalability. I think we're lucky that we have a program in Philadelphia that over the course of between 1990s, basically a 10-year period, they figured out how to scale this, relying on local community contractors and community groups. The challenge, I think, would be they have to build up to kind of maintain, to have the kind of that cost effectiveness. It has to be done on a scale where, for example, and this is very kind of just obvious when you think about it. Somebody's driving around, a group of contractors are in a truck with a lawnmower and a leaf blower and some bags to pick things up, just to do the maintenance. It's much more cost effective if you have a lot of them clustered together. And you can really reduce the marginal costs by doing that. So in terms of like trading that off versus say something like hiring additional police officer, I think that again, you'd have to have a program that you'd scaled so that you could really do that. You see what I'm saying? So like that. So, but I would bet that you wouldn't want to trade like a vacant lot for not having a police to respond. But like when it comes to marginal additions, marginal changes, that something you can scale. And I think it's possible that in a city where this is, you have programs like this that have been scaled up and well run, that would be a great, a good investment that could be made. But yeah, did I answer your question? Sort of.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
Yeah.
So I just want to note we're pretty much at time. That said, we do have the Zoom room for a little bit longer. And so I just like to invite, any of you who are sort of available and interested in chatting with the speaker sort of more informally for a little bit, feel free to stick around. I'll turn off the recording. And if you have more questions, then maybe now's the chance to get them answered. So with that, I'm gonna thank Professor MacDonald again on behalf of everybody. Thank you so much. I'll stop recording. Stop.